I want to talk about some things which are transformative. That is to say, I want to focus in now on the CRPD, the object of this week, and I want to get us going with actually the core issues, not the detail applications, that comes later on, for me anyway, this week, but for the central values, the values that make the CRPD what it is, the magnificent document that it is. And I'm going to focus on 3 articles, 1, 3, and 5, because they present, if you like, the foundational notions of the CRPD. And what I'm going to do, because first of all I'm a lawyer, but also bear witness to the fact that I'm a philosopher by training, I'm going to make the case that you cannot have vision, you cannot have action without direction. And direction is a matter often of understanding the nature of the values that you hold dear and say a lot, equality, but not always understand the length and breadth of those notions. And also, and one of the reasons that I think I'm giving this talk, the complexities that are built into a notion which we take for granted, namely equality. And I'm going to focus in on 4 features, there are many, of the notion of equality, which is built in, as you all know, to Article 3 and 5, that raise issues that, as a lawyer, I would see myself making arguments in terms of. As activists, you have to keep in mind, and as people who are interested in human rights in general, have to understand the potential problems with. So I'm going to give you not an eulogy, not a commendium of isn't equality wonderful. I'm going to ask you to think what equality is in 4 dimensions. The phrase on an equal basis of others, which is right across the convention, as you know, what's that about? And there is something it's about. The notion of equality of means or equality of ends, and the most perplexing of them all, equality of opportunity versus equality of result. And I'm going to introduce briefly a notion called capability. I then want to look at the notion of universalism, but perhaps I will tidy that up much more quickly than I thought. First of all, that's Article 1, that's Article 3, that's Article 5. Now you can see how quickly we can go through this lecture. The reason I gave you those 3 articles is because there are a lot of words in them, and as a lawyer, one of the things we have to do is be careful what the words mean and what is actually being said. So let's go back briefly with Article 1. The purpose of the present convention is to promote what? Human rights, fundamental freedoms. We didn't need Bickenbach to tell us that. But here's something which is unique in this document and potentially troublesome. There are some actual feminist writers who have said that dignity actually really doesn't have the weight to do some really heavy lifting in the human rights area. And I'm not going to talk about that except briefly. The second part of 1 has to do with what a person with disabilities is. And that is very important, has always been important, legally and conceptually. Let me give you my understanding of the conception of disability, conception of a person with disabilities. I just forget that, of course, I'm being tracked by the poor gentleman as I walk around the room, sorry. It makes it easier for me to think. That is embodied in the convention. This understanding says that on one side, it is a person with physical, mental, intellectual, sensory impairment, which is something that involves the human body, not to give you something you don't know already, but just to set that aside. But it's also about environmental barriers, things in the world, from attitudes, images, as Vic has pointed out, to barriers in the buildings and barriers in social policy, and somehow the interaction between those two things, between the impairment and the barrier, hinders full and effective participation. So the definition of disability, or as a philosopher I would say the conceptualization of disability, is not a simple one. It's a complex one, which is these days called interactive. And it has every impact right across the convention. What is important to keep in mind is the convention addresses barriers first and foremost, but it does not ignore impairments. And that is the delicate balance that is inherent in the application of the convention, as it has been in anti-discrimination law in the United States and elsewhere, this interesting balance between the cause of hindering the environment and the, if you like, characterization of disability in terms of impairment. Well, here's Article 3. Article 3 has several in fact, rights. Just for the purposes of this talk, equality between men and women and equality for children, I'm going to set aside and look at Article 3 and do a little clumping exercise, because to my mind there is some, not repetition, but some organization that will make it easier for understanding this as more than just a list of good things. It might be argued after Spike Lee, the famous black director, that all you have to do, you have a convention that's the Convention of the Rights of Man, do the right thing, period. That's all you need. Just do the right thing. I mean, what do we need all these words for? Just bloody do the right. Well, we know that do the right thing won't cut it. We need these words, both as lawyers and as advocates, to focus on what the right thing is, to be precise about the right thing, and to address the issues that are issues in a way which has forward movement. Hence these lovely terms, dignity, autonomy, yeah. What do they come to? Well, this is my clustering. I think dignity, autonomy, and respect for difference are of a piece. They're terms that reflect a central value about what it means to be a person, what it means to be valued as a person with differences, a person to make choices, a person that has dignity. So they fit into what we might call, what is the conception of a person in the convention? Well, these two are pretty obvious. Non-discrimination and equality of opportunity are obviously addressing equality, and I'll get back to them. How about the leftovers, participation and accessibility? Well, they have an interesting relationship. Accessibility is a means toward an end. Accessibility itself has no intrinsic value. Its value is wholly instrumental. Now, this is true, but you ask, who cares? You care because when you're making an argument for participation, your focus has to be on accessibility, but not for its sake. You look at the extent of accessibility in light of what you're after, which is participation, not for its own sake. Technology is wonderful, but you're not developing technology for the sake of technology. You're doing it to the degree and only to the extent that it produces participation. Technology itself may or may not facilitate participation. The convention says accessibility is important, but only because and to the degree to which it affects participation. You say this because, or I say this because, technology has a life of its own. We're all walking around with these bloody iPhones and whatnot. They lead us by the nose occasionally, but we want to lead it toward a direction, and that direction is participation. Well, accessibility obviously applies to those things too. So this is the arrangement. To my mind, accessibility is an instrumental value both for personhood and for equality and for participation. So this, as I mentioned to you, is the three items: inherent dignity, individual autonomy, and respect for difference, point to dignity. I wish I could speak to it, both its pitfalls, because the arguments that are being made about dignity being too ephemeral, too lightweight, too easy to achieve are not insignificant political arguments. There is a book that says that everything is lost in human rights if you put the weight on dignity. Why? Because you can imagine a sinister politician saying, "Dignity? You want dignity? Here it is. Thank you very much. No money is spent. I have given you bloody dignity, and I'm done." That won't work. Whatever dignity is, whatever equality is, it has to come with some actionable points. It has to tell us what we have to do, how, to what degree, and what's the object. I wish I could talk about it, but I'm going to talk about equality because it's even more difficult. Equality, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about four things, and perhaps only four things. First of all, the phrase "on an equal basis with others." If you go to even back to Article 1, you'll see the phrase prominently displayed. In the definition, what I characterized as the operating definition, who are people with disabilities? Well, they are people for whom various barriers hinder full participation and effective participation. There's no period after participation. What kind of participation? Who are you comparing it to? On an equal basis with others. Lawyers call this the comparator class. What it is, because anytime you have equality, you have to say equality with respect to whom? A marginalized group is treated unequally with respect, not in floating in the universe, but in respect to some other group. So what is the comparator? Everybody. This poses some problems in interpretation, as we will see. The most obvious one has to do with what's called progressive realization, which I will talk about later on in the week. You're not going to get rid of me this easily. For example, if you have a healthcare system that's completely impoverished and everyone in the country, or no one in the country has access to even the most obvious preventative care because the country is so poor, what does the convention say with respect to access to health care for persons with disabilities? That they get the same shitty health care that everyone gets. The comparator isn't an ideal situation, it's the real situation. Now, this is a good thing in interpretation, because there's one thing you can tell about the ideal situation: it'll never happen. So if you did say people with disabilities should get the best possible conceivable health care, the Minister of Health would say, right, I'm out of here. The bar, as we say in English, the bar is set so high that you might as well say convention schmention, who cares? I'll never achieve it, so why should we try? So a relative resource characterized comparator is sensible, but it's dangerous. Because if you try to move one group of individuals to a bar that is too low already for everyone, there is not much real improvement. So that means the pressure is on the notion of progressive realization, which I'll get to. But once you start, that was supposed to be slower, let me do it again. Once you start looking at the convention, I found the animation button on my, and I'm not looking back, let me tell you. Those are just the first couple of sections of the convention I have cut and pasted and have bouncing around the slide, because the phrase on an equal basis of others is everywhere, as it should be. A very interesting, clever legal drafting technique, which we don't fully understand until we start getting implementation puzzles being created. But it has two features. A positive feature, namely you have a realistic approach to implementation because you're not pitching it against an ideal situation. But the other side of that always is the potential for misapplication because of other issues. Okay, means or ends, is it a quality of means or a quality of ends? Well, lawyers call this the difference between procedural or substantive justice. Does everyone have their day in court? Procedural, who cares about the outcome? Or does everyone have the same kind of outcome? Does everyone have the same right to the same result? Well, if you look through the convention, and I'm going to do this a bit quickly, what you'll discover is certainly procedural language. Article 4 says state parties undertake to adopt all appropriate, to take all appropriate measures. So this is procedural language. The obligations in the convention are not to achieve health, to achieve employment, but actually to take the measures necessary to blah, blah, blah in various different ways. And this too is a very good thing, because if you do not oblige countries to begin processes, to institute programs, to take process measures, and only require them to have outcomes, what you'll discover is that the outcomes become unmanageably difficult, whereas the procedures that you could have been putting in place to incrementally reach outcomes were not unmanageable. Sorry, that's too fast. Well, you also have substantive, and there's no better example of a substantive end equality than Article 12. Anytime you have language that says recognizing X or reaffirming X, in this case personhood or legal capacity, you actually have a quality of end result, and a quality of, in this case, equal dignity, to mix the two together. Well, here's the kicker, and the one I want to spend a bit more time on, and certainly much more interesting animation. Quality of opportunity to result. And here's the conundrum, here's the puzzle. Article 5 speaks about equality and non-discrimination, using phrases which have a long history, some of them tracing themselves to the Americans with Disabilities Act. The phrase reasonable accommodation appears there. And the first section, equal before and under the law, and last year, as Steve might remember, I pointed out that this was copied from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which Steve and I are the only Canadians in the room, so I thought a little tip of the hat to that. But anyway, I cut that slide, but not the thought, as you can tell. But here's the problem. Article 3 talks about equality of opportunity. That's the phrase that's used, equality of opportunity. And the puzzle, the take-home exercise, you didn't think you had an exercise today, but you have one today. I'm just creating it for you. Is equality of opportunity equal, so to speak, to equal before and under the law and entitled without discrimination, etc., etc.? Is the sentence from Article 5 that gives you equality before, under the law, without discrimination, to the equal protection and equal benefit. I'm a vegetarian, but I often speak this way, the meatiest section of the convention, or as we would say, the tofu-ish section of the convention. This is where the tofu lies, so to speak. In this section, you have equality before and under. I mean, what, next to? I mean, what else do you need? Before and under. Entitled without discrimination, get that in there, although it's completely redundant, actually, because discrimination is inequality, so if you had equality, that means not, but never mind. Equal protection and equal benefit. Fantastic, all you would need. But is that the same of equality of opportunity? Question mark. Well, let me give you some reasons for being troubled by that. Philosophers understand at least two kinds of equalities. They're called equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Under the rubric, under the heading equality of opportunity, there are two, at least, recognized versions. One is formal, or sometimes called negative equality, or negative freedom. The other one is a version which I will be following, Amartya Sen's Nobel Prize for Economics capability sense of equality of opportunity. And these are two versions of equality of opportunity. A formal one, which is very, very strict and totally useless, and a much more robust and useful one called capability. So what is Article 5 then? Well, is it equality of outcome? And what's the difference? I just want to do that again. I found it. Bounce! Okay, enough of this nonsense. Okay, how can we explain the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome? Imagine life is a race. In some ways it is in a capitalist society. I'm literally calling it a race by having racers up there, two athletic people, fellow also, well, they're all athletic, but a fellow in a three-wheeled wheelchair, which I see on my track as I run around since I work in the Paralympic Center of Switzerland. Then a person in crutches, and unfortunately, an icon of the disability movement who may no longer be an icon. As mentioned, Oscar Pistorius, right, with the so-called Blade Runner. So we have these champs. Now, in the state of nature, the way the world is, people have different talents, right? Now and that means if red dotted line is the starting line, some people inherently are more talented, so they, in a sense, start before the starting line. I mean, they have an edge. They're fast, okay? They're not like me when I run, which I'd be over here. And other people have various disabilities, perhaps. In other words, they have different accommodations to impairments. So whatever is happening to them, they're probably behind the starting line, although Mr. Pistorius, when he's not killing people, is probably at the starting line. And one of the interesting things is, does that mean that he doesn't, in fact, have any even residual impairment left by virtue of this accommodation? Okay, in the state of nature, what dictates the result? Oh, I love it. Am I good? Okay. You want to see it again? No, I want you to take a look at the woman in crutches. How long did it take him to do that? Instead of reading law books? Okay. In the state of nature, what happens, the differential in technique or talent determines the outcome. This is nothing very special. So what do we do with equality of opportunity? Everyone starts at the same place. Okay? Formal equality of opportunity. no advantages. Artificial advantages caused by talents, but still they're socially recognized, so allowing the two people to be up front, and they don't have to run as far, and the people with this in the back, they have to run further. So you eliminate equality of opportunity literally. Everyone has the same opportunity. So if you're doing this graphically in a trivial example, what else can you say? Everyone starts at the same place. But what happens? Well, they end up in different places. Because equality of opportunity says people start the same. It doesn't say they end up the same. Now, what about equality of result? Actually, whether they start the same or different doesn't matter, because equality of result says everybody wins. The outcome of the race is equal. Those of you who have had children in daycare, these lovely races that they have in creches and daycare, where everyone wins. Oh my, everyone wins. Everyone gets first one. Well, that's this is communism. They're infiltrating our classrooms. Equality of result is a very hard, perhaps the hardest version of egalitarianism imaginable. People have different talents, let's say natural talents, that are already accommodated by the accessibility devices. It would be a very different story if you took those away as well, so there's another layer of accommodation already. And if you start the same line, equality of opportunity says, we're done here, we're finished. Equality is spent. Equality is done. That's all that political equality requires of us, that you don't have prejudice that puts people behind the line, unfair advantage, the Mitt Romneys of the world who, because of their wealth, can start really far ahead. I did transfer this into economic holdings. It's the same story. Poor people start behind the line. To get to the line, they have to expend lots of energy. Rich people start way at the... So this is a story about equality, even though it's silly and they're funny graphics and whatnot. This is the real world. Do we want everyone to end the same place? Well, basic equality of opportunity says there are no formal prohibitions. Remember, I had two. I had formal equality and capability. What that means is then when the gentleman in the wheelchair looks at the staircase or her legs or whatever he's looking at, formal equality is satisfied. Equality of opportunity is satisfied if there is no law that says if you're in a wheelchair, you cannot go to the second story. First story, sorry. First story, not to shift to my European here. Is there a prohibition to this gentleman getting to the... No, there's no prohibition. He just can't do it because he's in a wheelchair. So, no problem. Different talents. Some people are in a wheelchair, other people are not. They're free to do it if they can. That's equality of opportunity in its weakest form. You're free to do it, but if you can't do it, that's your problem. In the literature, equality of opportunity is almost zero on the egalitarian scale. So hence my problem. I should have had another say. What is Article 5 equality? If it's actually what we say it is under Article 3, equality of opportunity, then I submit that the convention is almost useless. It will eliminate prejudice because, in fact, the Americans with Disabilities Act, understanding of anti-discrimination, irrational beliefs, stereotypes, etc., it will remove those artificial obstacles like stigma, those artificially created barriers. The things that are unnecessary have nothing to do with the underlying impairment, nothing to do with the disability. Formal equality will do that, and it's not a bad thing. But the issue is, will it do any more, and in particular, will it redistribute resources? Will it make it possible for someone who could do something, get education, employment, but needs additional resources to do so? No. Formal equality is not strong enough. Well, there is a sense, that's the problem when you do it this way. There is a sense of equality of opportunity that does the job. It's called equality of capability. And here I need 30 seconds for a lifetime's work of Amartya Sen. Sen said, what is it? What is the currency? What is the coin that equality speaks in? What is it about equality of what was the question. Equality of what? Well, we have results, opportunities, equality of happiness, equality of welfare, equality. And he said, no. At the end of the day, the equality that means something politically, socially, morally, is the quality of capability. Well, what's capability? Capability is what you have when you realistically, concretely, and practically, feasibly have the freedom to do what you want. Now, giving a person the freedom to do what they want ain't enough. He has the freedom to do what he wants, but he will meet up with the stairs. He doesn't have feasible, implementable, realistic freedom, real freedom as it's sometimes called, because he's free to choose or not. Yes, I choose to go upstairs, he can't do it, bingo, freedom over. What you need, Sen argued, is a freedom that is empowered, if you like. And how do you know you have that equality of capability? The test is very simple. You have equality of capability to get a job, equality to have a family, equality to marry your boyfriend, or whatever, when at the end of the day, the only thing that separates you from achievement is choice. Whether you want to do it and choose to do it. Equality of capability means everything is provided for you so that you can really, really get that job, if you want it. Equality of capability, which is widely used in development studies for countries as an indicator of the success of the country in providing for its citizens. Do people realistically have the resources they need to do what they want? Is a very strong, but not very strong sense of equality, but it's not the same as equality of result because there still will be differences. So the race will not be equally won, even so, because some capabilities are intrinsic talents, so that there are going to be differences. Capability applies to the resources that can be provided to the individual. Okay, what is, going back to my question, my guess, and it's certainly my hope, given these two pieces of textual information, and I don't have the time to go into the analysis, is actually the Sen version. So what was hoped for, and God help us, what we hope is in is in the convention is equality of opportunity in the capability sense. Because if it's just plain negative freedom, nothing legally stands in your way except your inability to do it or the rest of it. It's not a sense of equality we can be happy with. I forgot when I started. I have 2 minutes. Part 2 is on universalism, and I just want to set out the problem because there's another interesting problem that, of course, I've solved completely, but you have to buy my book. There is nothing more universal than human rights. They apply to everyone. In fact, that's the nature of human rights. Without exception, modification, adjustment for race, economic status, religion, gender, disability, human rights are universal. The only credential you need is being human. You don't have to be a white human. You don't have to be a male human. You don't have to be an able-bodied human. Human is your entrance requirement. It's universal. Okay. What if there are cultural differences that are such that make, for example, women culturally unequal to men, as there are in many, many cultures around the world? And when, in my country, in Canada, when the equality provision was first instigated in 1980, the Inuit population in northern Ontario said, "What's all this rubbish about women being equal to men? What is this? You're violating," now I have to make this as serious as possible, "what it means for me to be an Inuit person. My cultural identity, my language, my culture, everything about what I count as me makes it essential that women are inferior. There's no way around it. That's my culture." The response of Pierre Elliott Trudeau was, "Tough for your culture." Well, easy to say. However, can we be so imperialistic? Because that's what it is. It's a form of imperialism. Your culture is bullshit, man! Join the Anglo-American bandwagon here, where we're doing all this great stuff. We have human rights. Your culture, 3,000 years old. I mean, get over it. Can we do that? Can we do that? Now, we have to do something, because as it happens, human rights are universal, or they're nothing at all, really. I mean, human rights for men but not women is not human rights. That's not what a human right is. But what do we do about cultures? And I used gender. Could I use disability? Without much trouble. In some cultures, mental illness is a smudge on the heritage of the family, is a problem that has to be hidden because it shows that there are elements in the family's history, going back generations, in which there has been some violation of religious or some other law. Now we can say, God, I love it, get over it. We can say get over it, but keep in mind what that means from an international political point of view. It means that one set of beliefs that are fairly common, but they're not universal, will just push out of the road other sets of beliefs. There's another aspect, and then I'll stop. Universalism, is it implementable? I mean, there is a practical problem. I'm speaking of these high-level concepts, but is there a practical problem? And as it happens, when I visit you on Friday for the other half of this talk, where I get practical, actually, the real problem at the end of the day is negotiation. Because every country, rich, poor, low, high resource, has to make decisions about resource allocation. There are what are called priority problems. If people with disabilities have the right to be considered for resources on the same basis as others, they're in the mix, they negotiate at the table, but they not necessarily leave the table with everything they need, because resources are finite. Governments have to set priorities. Sometimes they are hidden, doing things non-transparently, and the priorities are not the priorities that you would wish, but priorities are inevitable. It's easy to say that everyone who has difficulties making decisions for themselves get full resources for supportive decision-making, but where do the resources come from? Well, you can squeeze the military budget. You can squeeze other budgets, do what are called macro allocation decisions, and I bless you if you get away with it, do it. But at some point, equal basis with others kicks in. The convention does not allocate special rights. That's the first thing you learn about the convention. This is not a convention of rights for a bunch of people that no one else has. The point of the convention is on the equal basis with others. Is this going to be hard? It's going to be a real challenge, but perhaps not as much as that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I ask a question about how we're organizing things here today? My understanding is that we're going to go for about 30 minutes and then break for lunch. Am I right about that? It's now 10 minutes to 1. I'm just trying to set some parameters because I know people are hungry. And can you hear me? Yeah, is that right? So we're going to go till 1:15, and in that time we'd like to have a few minutes to ask Professor some questions. So, to the point then, I will be brief. How's that? I want to thank you very, very much for the opportunity to be here today. This is my second time in Galway at the summer school. Last summer was a tremendous experience, a really exciting, enlivening time, and I'm really pleased to be here again. My topic, or my task here, is to talk about how civil society created the convention. And I think that I've been reflecting about this over the past few weeks, thinking about it and doing some reading and so on about it. But it's an opportunity for me to think back to my own time in working on the convention. And I was particularly interested as I was reading and looking back to note that today is the 10th anniversary of the first day of the second ad hoc committee meeting. So 10 years ago today, Rosemary and Janet and others, Gerard, if he's somewhere in the room, we were all in New York City, and we were sitting in a room at the UN, and we were just at the cusp, just at the beginning of the work on the CRPD. You know, Gerard made a comment earlier today that 10 years ago something like this couldn't have happened, and you're entirely right about that. We have come so far in 10 years from those days in New York City where we didn't know whether there was going to be a convention or there wasn't going to be a convention. And what I wanted to do is give you a little sense of some of the feel of that kind of thing. Others here will talk to you about the details, the provisions of the treaty, and do so much better than I would be able to do. But what I can do is give you some sense of the time that we were together, because in those days, in 2003 and 2002, there was no guarantee there was going to be a CRPD, and in fact, when we came together in 2002 for the first time, it looked very much like the whole process was going to go off the rails, and certainly if countries such as mine or ours, Canada, had had their way, there would be no convention on the rights of people with disabilities. So I think that it's important for us as we go work through things here this week, to have a sense of that and a sense of the dynamics that were at play that shaped the treaty, because no one would suggest that it's a perfect document. There are lots of problems, lots of things that ought to be better or ought to be different, but it is, I think, the best product that we were able to achieve given the circumstances that we were working in. And it's those circumstances that I wanted to take a few minutes and talk to you about. So as I say, today is the 10th anniversary of the first day of the second meeting of the ad hoc committee. That's a lot of numbers in one sentence, but I hope you understand what I mean. There was a press release that came out on that day from the UN. It's UN General Assembly press release 10140, and I take an excerpt from that to start off my remarks here today. It says, Luis Gallegos, the president of the ad hoc committee and permanent representative of Ecuador to the United Nations, said at the opening that what happened at this session would have an impact not only on the rights and dignity of people with disabilities, but on societies at large. The problem, he said, that brings us together in New York is not another negotiation, but the determination to achieve a process that started 20 years ago, and whose objective is to give dignity to people with disabilities and to protect their rights. Mr. Gallegos went on to say, Mr. Gallegos paid homage to the persistence and dedication of hundreds of representatives of non-governmental organizations of people with disabilities, many of them present at the session, who are calling for the drafting of an international convention in the shortest possible time. So that was the press release that came out on the first day of the second ad hoc committee meeting. And I thought a lot about this over the past few days and cast my mind back into that time and talk about the voice of people with disabilities in the negotiation process. The biggest challenge for disabled people's organizations, and I think something that is relevant for people who are working to ratify and implement the convention around the world now, the biggest challenge was to find a way to integrate people with disabilities and our organizations into the process around the drafting of the convention. I mean, we arrived in New York City in 2002. None of us knew each other. Now I look across the room and I see my old friends from Australia and America and things that I've known for a decade. But in those days, I didn't know them. They didn't know me. We were all unknown quantities. We were trying to find a way to work together. The one thing that we agreed on is that disabled people had to have a strong voice in the process. That's the only thing that bound us together. The things that we might say with that strong voice could be vastly different. And the challenge was to find a way for our organizations of disabled people to work together to build trust, to build understanding, and to move things forward. I read with interest over the weekend Janet's article from 2004 that talks about this. Janet, I don't know if you remember the article. You talk about the organizing of disabled people's organizations. And it was a sort of, when we arrived in New York City, at that time in 2002 particularly, there were 7 big international disabled people's organizations, the so-called International Disability Alliance, Disabled People's International, with whom I worked, Rehab International, the World Blind Union, and a few others. Those 7 organizations sort of saw the whole process at the UN as a process that they owned, if you will. Those organizations, DPI, RI, and those kind of expected to be the voice of people with disabilities in that process. And we worked and we struggled very hard in 2002 and 2003 to find a way to achieve some balance between those 7 long-standing organizations, and all of the dozens and hundreds of other disabled people and organizations that arrived in New York City at the time. And I can remember sitting in the rooms in the bowels of the UN with many people who were in this room here today and others to try to find a way forward, to struggle. And it was a real struggle, and struggle that you will find in your own countries as you move to ratify and implement the convention, a struggle for disabled people's organizations to find a way to work together. There was a real challenge in 2002 and 2003. We came into the meeting in 2002 with these 7 organizations expecting to carry the day, and then all of these other organizations saying, but I'm here too, and I have just as much right to be heard as do you. So we struggled in those times to find a way forward with that. And the solution that we came up with, we formed an organization called the International Disability Caucus. And that International Disability Caucus was an amalgam of the 7 IDA members and all of the other organizations. And the other organizations were grouped regionally. So those other organizations that weren't members of IDA organizations were set in organizations. So there was an African region of organizations, an Americas region, a European region, and so on. And each of those groupings, the regional groupings and the IDA members, elected one member to a steering committee, and this IDC steering committee was the entity that moved the voice of people with disabilities through the process. So I came into these meetings as a DPI person, but wound up on the IDC steering committee as a representative from North America during those early days of 2002, 2003. And I think that the reason I tell you this is because it was a real challenge. There were long hours of struggle and conflict to find a way forward, to find a way to achieve a consensus, but we did that. And I think that that's an important lesson that the disability community learned, because we knew very much that we wanted to have a voice and we needed to find a way to make that clear. So that was the thing that happened in the rooms outside during the first meeting of the ad hoc committee. A couple of things that happened in the ad hoc committee meetings itself that gave some voice to people with disabilities are interesting to note, because at that meeting of the ad hoc committee, it wasn't clear formally how disabled people would engage in the process. There were no rules set. We had to make the rules as we went, and disabled people's organizations met with the Bureau and with Ambassador Gallegos and people to ensure that our organizations had a voice, and it was set up so that the meetings would take place, and typically in these meetings, state parties are able to take the floor, and only state parties are able to take the floor. But we made sure that there was a place and in time in each of the meetings for disabled people's organizations to participate. And then within that time, we had to find a way to allocate time between this organization of the International Disability Caucus and individual disability organizations. There were challenges associated with that, but we did find a way to move it forward. And I'm looking at time here, so I want to draw things to a close, but what I want to say to you is that from the first meetings of the ad hoc committee in 2002, we moved into 2003, and the big challenge in 2003 was to get away from this discussion of, are we going to have a convention or are we not going to have a convention, and instead find a way to actually move things forward. So the idea that came to the floor very early in the second ad hoc meeting was the ad hoc committee meeting, was the creation of a so-called working group. Okay, and this working group and this the composition of the working group was really the big debate and the big challenge of the second ad hoc committee meeting. If you read back through the convention archives and other things that have been written about this, you'll see that in its early incarnation, the working group was to be states, parties, and some disability organizations. And the first idea was that the working group would have some states, parties, and they said initially 7 disability organizations would be represented on the working group. And this made it immediately a default position that those 7 disability organizations would be the big IDA organizations that I spoke about in the beginning. So there was a huge amount of debate and lobby that happened around this to find a way to break that deadlock of these 7 organizations and move it more broadly. And what happened in the end was that the working group itself adopted the process that the IDC had, and it took the 7 organizations of the International Disability Alliance and 5 regional organizations so that you have, if you look at the documents, the historical documents, you'll see that there are 12 representatives from the disability community that were part of that working group. And that's why it was 12, was because to get away from the 7 IDA folks. So that's what we have with the working group. We have 12 organizations of people with disabilities, 7 IDA members and 5 regional organizations, 27 governments, and 1 national human rights institution representative. So those 40 entities were the people that came together in the room in January of 2004 to prepare the first draft of the convention, which contained, if you look in the historical record, 27 provisions. So those 27 articles, the first draft of the Disability Convention, came out of the working group meeting in 2004. And I think that I want to leave it at that, just because I know that our time is running out and I want to give people a chance to ask questions. But the key point that I want to convey to you here with regards to the voice of people with disabilities in the drafting of the convention is that we came into the process with a certain amount of historical baggage, if you will, from these IDA organizations expecting to lead the day. Same kinds of things are happening in countries around the world, and a key piece to the success of us moving forward was to find a way out of that historical reality of these 7 big organizations and to move to embrace all disability organizations and to find ways to work together. I think a key message of the convention and a key piece of our success is that we as people with disabilities managed to find ways not to always agree with one another, but to find ways to politically come to terms with things and find a way forward as one voice of people with disabilities. And for me, that's one of the key achievements of the CRPD. All of the legal documentation aside, one of the key achievements is that for that one moment, at least in time, the international disability community was able to speak with one voice. And as we spoke with that one voice, we were tremendously powerful, and it was a wonderful thing to behold. Thank you very much.